So I'm Shilpa HSRAANZ. I have a number of roles. I'm based in Adelaide. I'm the National Clinical Director of a consumer organisation called Kidney Health Australia. I'm also a nephrologist at the Royal Adelaide Hospital and employed half-time purely for clinical work. I chair the clinical research group in my renal unit, and I'm also a clinical title holder, associate professor at the University of Adelaide. So my pathway has really started with medicine. I come from a family with a fairly strong medical background. Both my parents were overseas born and trained doctors, and we migrated to Australia when I was 2. I was born in Fiji. I went to school in Adelaide and finished my high school here. I then did 6 years of an undergraduate medical course in Adelaide, a year of internship in Adelaide, and then 3 years of basic physician training, all in Adelaide. The physician training 3-year process ends with a massive written exam, and then if you get through the written exam, your prize is that you get to do a clinical exam, and that is sort of the most harrowing thing I think that I've ever been through, and nothing that comes later in life really compares to that. But after the basic physician training is over and you've passed those 2 exams, you can then go on and do your specialist training, which I did mostly, again, in Adelaide. And so I think the story that I'd like to say at this point is I really had a very straightforward trajectory at this point, that you did one thing, then you moved on to the next thing, then you moved on to the next thing. And really the hardest decisions that I had to make about career at that point were whether I did medicine or not. And coming from from my background, there was a reasonable expectation that I would go into medicine. I was only 16 when I started university. And then following that, the next big decision was whether I went into surgical or physician training, and I chose physician training, and that was a fairly natural fit for me. And then deciding which specialty to undertake. And I really liked the idea of doing renal medicine because I'd spent some time on the renal unit at the Royal Adelaide, and I really enjoyed the staff and the clinicians that I had worked with there. And I liked the fact that it was quite an academic subspecialty, and that you had very particular long-term relationships with patients who often had very complex medical problems. So all of that appealed to me. I started my research career really during those years of specialist training, and for doctors, often the way that you start with research is to do what we call clinical audits. So that's looking at a particular clinical problem and going back and seeing how many patients have had that problem, what their outcomes might have been, very simple data collection, and that's often how doctors cut their teeth in research, and that led to a few presentations and publications, and it's now embedded as part of our training as we do specialist training. Following that training, I completed my specialist qualifications during a clinical research fellowship, which I took at St Mary's Hospital in London, where I worked in a kidney transplant and pancreas transplant unit, and worked on some of their databases that they had, and did some research around the influence of different ethnic backgrounds on outcomes for people with kidney disease. And so that was very interesting. I had a wonderful opportunity to actually live and work in London. I actually got paid, which was really nice, and it meant that my husband and I, we were newlyweds at the time. It meant that we could travel, and it was really a lovely phase of life. One of the really key things about that research fellowship was I knew we weren't going to stay in London, and the unit that I worked with knew that we weren't going to stay. So there was no expectation on either side that I needed a job at the end of that, and that they needed to provide me with a job, which kind of took the pressure off both parties, and I could just be there and do my work and learn and enjoy, and everybody knew that I was leaving and that they wouldn't have to be responsible for finding me a job, which was very good. So then I returned to Adelaide with my specialist qualifications in 2003, and that was the end of a journey that started in 1990. And so really by that stage I was keen to get going with my actual career, having done all of the training that was required. However, I decided to stall actually being a kidney specialist and getting on with my career even further by undertaking a PhD. So in 2004, I started a basic science PhD, again in Adelaide at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And this was a PhD, benchwork lab science PhD in transplant immunology and dendritic cell biology. And I was actually using a non-human primate animal model, which had brought very significant challenges with it, using that particular animal model. And that PhD took me 6 years. I did some of it part-time. I had 2 children during that time and delivered my thesis a year, actually in the week of my second child's first birthday. So I wrote my thesis with a newborn baby at hand. I only got 4 papers out of that PhD, one of which was a review paper, because the subject matter was a very laborious basic science process, and experiments took weeks and weeks to perform, and data collection therefore was a very long process. And often with basic science PhDs you don't get huge rafts of publications out of them. During that time, I did continue to see patients so that I could keep up my clinical registration, and I did a clinic per week in which I saw sort of a dozen or so patients, and that was really great to be able to keep up those clinical skills while I was doing my PhD. I had an NH and MRC postgraduate scholarship for that PhD, and that was really helpful to support me through that time. And I had a wonderful husband who also supported us and made sure the bills were paid and so on and so forth. The usual pathway after this would have been for me to undertake postdoctoral work in an overseas laboratory, and there were many opportunities that were available, and I could have done that by applying for various fellowships that were available to us in nephrology. But I actually hadn't completely fallen in love with basic science. I think partly because I used animal models in my PhD. It wasn't something I really wanted to keep going on with. I appreciated the knowledge that I learnt during this time, and I appreciate the fact that I really have a very good understanding of basic science, but I didn't want to continue down that pathway, and we were very much tied to Adelaide, so I didn't really want to go away again. So I thought it was time to get a real job, and applied for a staff specialist position in my own unit that had come up. I was very keen to work part-time because I had young children, and that was a very novel concept in my unit. I was the first female kidney specialist that my unit had had for over 20 years. They'd not had to deal with the concepts of maternity leave, part-time work, etc. And I think probably at that time they weren't really ready for it. And even though I was what had been considered to be the natural person for this position, ultimately I was unsuccessful in gaining that position, and it was given to somebody who was interested in working full-time. That was a really difficult period to be unemployed within my own unit that I'd been working with for over a decade. And I found that mentors that I had who went into bat for me were very, very valuable. And ultimately, in 2011, a part-time position was actually created for me to then be able to join the unit. And I think that was absolutely instrumental in progressing my career, and I acknowledge the role that my mentors had to play in making sure that actually happened. But it meant that I had to, at that juncture, redesign my career away from basic science and away from transplantation. The position that I ultimately got was not a transplant nephrologist position, which had been my aspiration. And it required at that time a bit of flexibility in my thinking and a bit of redefinition of what I wanted to achieve and who I wanted to be as a kidney specialist and as a researcher. So I call my career really the do-it-yourself career. It hasn't followed those usual natural pathways where one thing has built into another. So at that juncture in time where I found myself having applied for the only kidney specialist job that was going in Adelaide, knowing that I had to stay in Adelaide and not being successful, I had to do a little bit of a rethink. And I developed in that time a real interest in something called obstetric nephrology, which is the care of women with kidney disease through pregnancy. And I thought, well, this is something I really do want to pursue. And I didn't need, at that stage, that didn't need any specific training. There wasn't a special qualification for it, although there is now. So I kind of set up my own training program at our local women's and children's hospital. I identified the team there. There was no such thing as obstetric nephrology in South Australia at the time. There were no kidney specialists who were interested in pregnancy. So I worked with other physicians who looked after these patients but who were not kidney specialists, and I learned from them and eventually started my own clinic in the renal unit. And my own unit were very supportive of me setting up this clinic. They allowed me to use my clinical time in order to do this clinic. And that's something that's really grown, and I'm now sort of one of the national experts in this area, and have gradually built a profile. I started a research program that uses a lot of mixed methodology research, including qualitative registries, cohort studies, and some basic science work as well. And that's been funded by a whole series of small Category 2 and Category 3 grants. And it was a real challenge to actually develop this subspecialty career in South Australia at a time where there was no one else doing it, and it's one of the things I'm really proud of, because we now have a cohort of people, of younger nephrologists coming through who are really interested in this area in South Australia, and we're now building a network across different campuses and across the country as well. So that's been really very exciting. One of the other parts of my do-it-yourself career came about from being really involved in research within my own unit and recognising that there was a lot of research being done, but there was no particularly coordinated research activity. We had a lot of junior researchers who were really in need of mentorship and a system in which they could operate and develop their research skills. And that we so having recognised that, I kind of complained about it a bit to the leadership within my unit, and their response was, well, if you're really seeking mentorship and you really want to create a platform for researchers to be mentored within the unit, create it yourself and stop complaining. And so that's kind of what I did. I took that to heart. And so in 2015, I set up something called the Clinical Research Group. We're several years down the track now. We're still looking for a more interesting and exciting title for our group, but for the moment, then the name HSRAANZ Clinical Research Group has stuck. So I think we're unfortunately stuck with it rather than anything more exciting. And our mission is to embed clinical research into our daily clinical practice. We see a lot of patients in our unit, and they're a very captive cohort, being kidney patients. Once you've got kidney failure, you really never stop being a kidney patient. You can never be cured. You can be treated, but kidney failure lives with you until you die. So it's a very captive cohort of patients, and they have a huge symptom burden and a huge range of health problems. And so anything that we can do to try and improve the quality of their life and improve their experience is very important clinical research that can be almost immediately translated into clinical practice. So our research group now has evolved over time. We've actually got quite a large cohort of researchers, and I chair this research group. And we're doing a whole range of multidisciplinary patient-centred research projects looking at quality of life, patient experiences, specific issues that renal patients face, and developing some intervention studies as well now. And we collaborate with a lot of other departments in the hospital and across a number of research institutions as well, particularly in areas where we don't have great skill sets internally within the renal unit. And the other thing we're doing is leading a huge range of activities around consumer engagement in research, which, as many of you would know, is really gaining momentum and is becoming a key priority. So, so there were the bits that I kind of had to do myself, and then there were the bits which I call orchestrated serendipity. It was things that happened to me by chance, but it was kind of about being in the right place at the right time as well. And so an example is my work that I do with the HSRAANZ data registry, which is the national or international actually, because it includes New Zealand, dialysis and transplant registry. And that registry happened to be, it was started in our renal unit and is now located in the Samari Research Institution, which is just next door to our hospital. And I initially started working with them with a small project to do with pregnancy in women with kidney disease. And over time, that's really grown into a very massive collaboration across many other projects as well. And it was just about actually being around when the registry became involved in an NH&MRC program grant. I was then included as an associate investigator, and then I've been able to work with that collaborative group over the last 4 years. And we're now moving forward with a CRE application around patient engagement in research, and I've been promoted to CI in that process. So that's been a really fantastic collaboration for me, and it's done a lot to help build my research skill set and get me involved in a lot of different projects. But it was just being in the right place at the right time and joining in and riding the wave that the registry was going through. My role as the Medical Director of Kidney Health Australia, which is a national consumer organisation and a peak body, was very much about being in the right place at the right time. This position was, I was actually asked to undertake this position by the CEO at the time, who I happened to cross paths with when I was organising a national renal meeting. And that CEO is no longer with the organisation. She only lasted 6 months, and we kind of joke that her decision making was sometimes quite random, but in this case it really worked well in my favour. Being able to take on this role has been the ultimate career game changer for me. I would say I've been in the role for 2 years now, and the week before I was asked to take on this role, I would have had no idea that 2 years down the track I would have this position, that it would jettison me into a whole bunch of national roles and steering committees. We've been working very closely with government, and we've just finished a national strategic action plan for kidney disease. So I've been working very heavily in the policy space. And we've also been riding the wave, the momentum that's going on about consumer engagement in research. So that was absolute serendipity, completely unpredictable. I couldn't have made it happen, but it's been an opportunity that I have tried to grasp and get as much out of it as possible. Another example is work that I've been doing in nephrology in Fiji, which started through some quite random personal connections, but again it was about being involved and saying yes to things, and I've joined a sister renal centre program there, and what started off as trying to support some clinicians who were trying to get nephrology up and running as a specialty in Fiji has actually turned into supporting research in Fiji. There's not much nephrology in Fiji. A lot of people die because there is no, there's very limited access to kidney failure treatment. But the government, we've been working with the government around policy around this, and there's things are building there, and there is now dialysis and other treatments being offered, and so we need good data, and we need to set up a registry, and we need good research coming out in parallel with the clinical service. So that was again being sort of around and engaged and interested and getting involved in something that has then built. So I just wanted to summarise what I've learnt through that journey. I hope I've been able to show you that it's actually been not linear at all. I haven't followed the usual career pathway of finishing medicine, doing a PhD, going on and doing postdoctoral work, and then continuing along in the same vein and building a body of research in a particular area. I've actually jumped around quite a bit, so I sort of do feel I'm a jack of all trades but a master of none. But I think having that broad overview of research has helped me. I've had a few twists and turns, including some dark moments where I wasn't quite sure which way my career was going to go. But I think the one thing I have been, I haven't been particularly strategic, but I have been flexible, and it's allowed me to take up chances that I might have otherwise not considered or not thought about, and not taken up. I do feel my skill set is fairly diverse. Sometimes I think I'm a traffic cop, sort of pulling together people and directing research, my researchers and my team in various directions, because I do have a reasonable overview of sort of the research landscape in nephrology. And it's been helpful to sort of understand both the basic science and clinical science world. I do have a problem with saying yes to things, because I've learned that if sometimes randomly saying yes to something will then lead to new opportunities. But I also think I need to get better at saying no, because I'm slightly overcommitted at the moment and at risk of not finishing things that I've started because I'm saying yes to too many things. So that's a really interesting balance. How do you take up opportunities when you don't know which way they're going to go, but not get too committed and bogged down so that you never finish anything? I have tried to actively seek mentors, not just within my own specialty, but also from outside of health, and try and identify those people. And even if it's just sitting down and having a cup of coffee and saying, look, how would you deal with this situation, or how have you gotten to where you are? I think we have a lot to learn from people in the corporate world and outside of the health sector. A lot of the challenges are actually the same, but they're sometimes better resourced to deal with them, and there are definitely better pathways for formal training around leadership outside the health sector. And my final comment would be, the one thing I've done at every stage is to really enjoy the work that I'm doing, whatever it was. Although towards the end of my PhD, I can't say I really enjoyed the animal model work when I was 38 weeks pregnant. That was pretty challenging. But apart from that, I love my job, and I think that's critically important, because you do have to work hard, and there will be ups and downs, and they're really difficult to take if you're not absolutely committed to what you're doing and loving what you're doing. And in the end, life is too short to be miserable while you just advance your career. You have to use your career as a way to seek your own life goals and enjoy the journey.